Welcome to the History AI Podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the History AI Podcast. I'm Chuck.
And I'm Marco. Before we charge into today's medieval mayhem, do us a solid. Hit subscribe wherever you're listening, and if you like the show, leave a 5-star review.
Seriously. A 5-star review is like handing us the royal standard and saying, go forth and be seen. It helps the podcast grow, it helps new listeners find us, and it makes Marco feel emotionally secure.
It's true. I'm a delicate historical flower. Also, quick reminder, our episodes are evergreen. You can listen to this one next week, next year, or after you've been trapped in a castle for 3 winters. It'll still make sense.
And if you want to suggest topics, hit us up on social media. We love listener suggestions, especially when they come with unhinged enthusiasm and a suspicious amount of confidence. Also, be sure to stay tuned after the episode for the original song, Banner of the Falcon.
Also, we've got new merchandise. There's a link in the show notes. Wear the merch, become the merch, live the merch.
All right, today's episode, Sir David Mathew, a Welsh knight wrapped in legend, stitched into the Wars of the Roses, and connected to a cathedral tomb you can still go visit. He's one of those figures who's famous in a very specific way. If you know, you really know.
And if you don't know, you're about to know, and possibly develop an opinion about medieval job titles you never asked for.
Let's start by setting the stage, because Sir David Mathew doesn't make sense unless you can feel what 15th-century Wales and England are doing at the time. We're in the 1400s, and it's a world where the idea of the state is still kind of vibes. Power isn't a neat ladder, it's a web. Land, favors, marriages, offices, and the ability to show up with armed men on short notice. That's what makes you real.
And if you're picturing tidy borders and consistent laws, stop that. This is Britain in the 15th century. It's like someone took the rule book, tore out half the pages, and then the remaining pages got wet.
Exactly. Sir David Mathew, often called David ap Mathew in Welsh, is a figure rooted in Glamorgan, in South Wales, in that marcher border environment where local lords have a lot of autonomy and the Crown's authority can feel negotiable. The marches are basically the zone where England's authority and Welsh local power have been staring each other down for centuries, and by the 1400s, it's less frontier wilderness and more who has the better network today.
It's like, welcome to the borderlands. Your rights depend on who likes you this week.
And you have to remember what's happened not that long before. In the early 1400s, Wales sees the Great Rebellion led by Owain Glyndwr. Huge, traumatic, and not just a footnote. Even after it's suppressed, the aftershocks linger. Suspicion toward Welsh elites, shifts in landholding, hard feelings, and the general understanding that loyalty is watched.
So, if you're a Welsh gentleman with ambition, you're playing on hard mode. People in power are paying attention to where your loyalties point, and your neighbours are paying attention to whether you're getting ahead.
Right. Now zoom out to England. The monarchy is increasingly unstable. The later years of Henry II's reign are filled with factional rivalry, political paralysis, and a king who's not consistently able to impose authority. That opens the door to the kind of private power that magnates love. Big families with huge estates, private armies, and the ability to make the law work for them.
The king is weak. Sounds abstract until you realize it means your local strongman becomes the actual government. Like, congratulations, your mayor now has a siege engine.
And that instability is the oxygen that feeds the Wars of the Roses. This isn't just two families have a spat. It's a prolonged struggle for legitimacy, patronage, and survival. People choose sides because it determines whether their lands are safe, whether their rivals get promoted, and whether their sons end up as hostages or honored guests.
Or, classic medieval coin flip, honored guest who is also kind of a hostage.
Exactly. So Sir David Mathew shows up in this environment as a member of the Welsh gentry, meaning he's not a duke, he's not sitting at the absolute top table of the realm, but he's locally important, connected, and positioned in the layer of society that makes things happen. Men like him administer estates, manage relationships with bigger lords, serve in local offices, help keep order, or disrupt it. And when war comes, they're the ones who can mobilize manpower.
He's the type of person who knows the roads, knows the families, knows who owes who money, and knows how quickly you can get 50 armed men to a meeting that's definitely just a discussion.
And crucially, he's tied to Llandaff and the cathedral world there. Cathedrals aren't just spiritual centers. They're political and economic institutions with land, income, courts, influence, and constant interaction with local elites. If you're close to that machine, you're close to power.
Medieval church politics, all the drama of a royal court, but with more Latin and better robes.
And so, when the national crisis deepens, when the throne itself becomes contested, someone like Sir David is in the perfect position to become historically visible. Not because he's writing royal edicts, but because he's the kind of person whose loyalty matters to kings and whose actions shape what happens on the ground.
Which is why we even know his name. You don't get remembered in the 15th century for being chill. You get remembered for being useful, connected, and ideally on the winning side.
Exactly. And in the tradition that grows around him, Sir David becomes associated strongly with the Yorkist cause and the rise of Edward IV. Because in a time when the country is basically arguing over who gets to be the legitimate center of power, being able to say, our man was there, our man helped, our man mattered, is everything.
It's not just biography, it's a claim. A family story that says, we weren't passengers in history, we had our hands on the wheel.
Okay, so now that we've got the world in our heads, let's zoom in on the place where Sir David's story really sets its roots, Llandaff. Today, it's basically part of Cardiff, but in the 15th century, it's a serious node in the local power network. Because the cathedral isn't just a church, it's an institution with land, money, legal privileges, and the kind of influence that doesn't need a sword to cut you.
Cathedrals are like medieval corporate headquarters, but with incense and guilt.
And the key thing is, if you're tied to a cathedral's administration, if you're the kind of person managing estates, collecting rents, enforcing rights, you're standing at the intersection of sacred authority and practical power. You're not just praying, you're steering.
Which is where those job titles come in. People hear steward or senescal and think it's a guy carrying a tray.
In this context, it's more like you're the operations manager for a major landholding institution. You're the person who makes sure the cathedral's properties produce income, that disputes get handled, that tenants don't decide to try something cute, and that the cathedral's interests are defended in a world where everyone is constantly trying to expand their slice of the pie.
So Sir David isn't just a knight. He's a knight who knows spreadsheets, except the spreadsheet is a stack of parchment, and the cells are peasants who owe you chickens.
Exactly, and you can see how that would make him important locally. Glamorgan is full of rivalries between families, between factions, between local lords and church lands. The cathedral's holdings bring it into contact and conflict with the same people who dominate secular politics.
Which means if you're the cathedral's guy, you have power. But you also have enemies, because your job is basically to say no for a living.
Right? And this is how you get the power stack. Above you are major nobles and magnates, big players who can change the temperature of a whole region. But beneath them, you've got men like Sir David who actually make the region function day to day. They're the connective tissue. They translate big national politics into local reality.
And they're also how local grudges can reach national levels. Because if you're connected to the right patron, your neighbor's petty feud can become a political crisis.
Exactly. And the cathedral gives you legitimacy, not just wealth, legitimacy. In a world where honor and reputation are currency, being visibly associated with an ancient institution makes you look established, respectable, anchored.
It's the medieval version of standing in front of a very expensive building to take a photo and pretending it's yours.
And because cathedrals are memory machines, too, records, monuments, burial spaces, your association can outlive you. Your name becomes part of the place's story. That's a huge reason Sir David Mathew doesn't just vanish into the fog like a lot of gentry do.
It's also a reminder that medieval power is not just battlefields. It's paperwork, it's property lines, it's courts, it's who gets to appoint whom, it's who gets buried where.
And that last part matters a lot. If your family is embedded at Llandaff, you're not only powerful while you live, you're curating your afterlife. You're placing your memory where future generations can't ignore it.
Which is honestly the most medieval flex possible. Yes, I'm dead, but I'm still in the good spot.
And with Sir David, this cathedral connection becomes a platform. When the Wars of the Roses escalate and the Yorkist cause starts pulling loyalists into its orbit, someone with local authority, institutional ties, and the ability to mobilize support is exactly the kind of figure who can step from regional importance into national legend.
Which is our cue, because once civil war turns into the kind of chaos where kings personally need loyal muscle, that's when the Sir David Mathew story gets its most famous chapter.
Yep, now we're heading to the battlefield. Snow, wind, confusion, and one of the most infamous days of the Wars of the Roses.
I hate that you said it like a travel brochure.
Visit Towton, complimentary trauma included. So we're moving from cathedral corridors and estate management into the place where reputations get forged fast, the battlefield. By the time we reach 1461, the struggle for the throne has stopped being a noble argument with paperwork and started being a full-contact contest where the winner gets to define reality.
And the loser gets to define compost.
Edward of York is on the rise, and he's doing the hard, brutal work of turning a claim into a crown. That means he needs more than bloodlines. He needs visible victories, loyal supporters, and people who will stand near him when things get ugly.
Because if you're claiming you're the rightful king, it really helps if you don't get killed in the part where you're trying to become king.
Exactly, and then comes Towton, a battle that isn't remembered as a tidy clash of knights, but as a grinding, chaotic storm of violence. It's one of those moments where later generations look back and go, that day decided a lot.
Also, imagine choosing to fight a giant battle in weather that feels like the sky is actively mad at you. The medieval commitment to bad decisions is unmatched.
And this is where Sir David Mathew steps into the story in a way that makes him larger than just a regional figure with important connections. The tradition says that during the chaos of Towton, he performed an act of loyalty that mattered directly to Edward, often boiled down to the phrase, "He saved Edward's life."
Which is the kind of sentence that once it enters family history, never leaves. You can practically hear someone telling it at a banquet. And then our David, yes, our David, pulled the future king back from the edge of disaster.
Right? And whether that's literally true in the movie scene sense or true in a more realistic way, guarding him, holding a position, rallying men, keeping the king's presence from collapsing, the point is the same. It places Sir David at the hinge of the story.
It turns him from important in Glamorgan into important in the narrative of England.
And that's a big deal. Because in civil war, kings are not just rulers, they're magnets. People become famous in the orbit of that magnet. If you're close enough, your name sticks to the legend.
So then we get the reward story, that Edward IV recognizes his service and gives him a prestigious role connected to the royal standard.
Which, in medieval terms, is basically the king saying, I'm going to make your loyalty visible. Because the standard isn't decoration, it's identity. It tells troops where the king is, it tells everyone who's winning, and it becomes the symbol people remember when they remember the day.
Carrying it is like carrying the Wi-Fi router for the whole army. If it goes down, everyone panics.
Exactly. And that's how the Sir David Mathew story becomes sticky. It ties together what medieval society loved most: bravery, proximity to power, and a reward that can be displayed by you, by your descendants, and by anyone who wants to tell the tale later.
Also, it's just an irresistible image. A Welsh knight on an English battlefield, the wind shredding visibility, the fight turning into a blur, then this moment of loyalty that gets repeated until it becomes a kind of family crown jewel.
And once you have that, it changes how everything else about him is remembered. His local importance becomes proof he deserved to be there. His cathedral ties become proof he was respectable. His connections become proof he wasn't a random sword for hire. It all snaps into place.
It's like his biography retroactively gets a spotlight installed.
Exactly. But of course, the battlefield chapter is only half the story. Because surviving the big national crisis doesn't mean you're safe. In many ways, it just means you go back home with a brighter target on your back.
Which brings us to the part of his story that feels almost painfully medieval. You can endure civil war, and still be undone by local conflict afterward.
So imagine the return. You've been near the center of something enormous. Wars that decide who gets to call himself king. Battles that will be talked about for generations. The kind of chaos that turns ordinary days into history. And then you ride back into South Wales, where the roads are the same, the rivalries are the same, and the people who disliked you before now have a new reason to dislike you.
Because nothing says, "Please resent me," like coming home with royal favor and a story people can't stop repeating.
Exactly. In a place like Glamorgan, power is intensely local. People remember slights, families keep score, land disputes don't fade, they ferment. And if you've gained status through your connection to the new regime, it doesn't just elevate you, it reshuffles the local pecking order.
Which is the medieval version of flipping a table in a crowded tavern and then acting surprised that everyone is suddenly paying attention.
And this is where the darker tradition about Sir David Mathew starts to feel plausible in tone, even if the details are messy. The idea that his end wasn't on a battlefield, but in local violence. A clash tied to tensions in the region, often placed at Neath, and sometimes pinned on an old rival family.
It's one of those stories where the specifics can blur over time, but the shape of it makes sense. Not because the past is predictable, but because the social conditions are.
Right? By this point, you've got a man who is visibly important, with institutional ties, with a strong political identity attached to him, and with a reputation that's only grown. That's a recipe for being involved in disputes where pride and fear do most of the talking.
And medieval disputes don't always stay at stern letters. Sometimes they jump straight to your household versus my household.
Exactly. If something boils over in a town, whether it's a feud, a confrontation, an attack that becomes a wider brawl, prominent men are the ones most likely to be targeted, blamed, or dragged into it. Not because they're reckless necessarily, but because they're symbols. Harming them sends a message.
Medieval communication strategy, violence as a press release.
And that's what makes his supposed death in local conflict so narratively potent. It gives his life a grim symmetry. He survives the big national struggle, but the smaller, more personal world, where grudges live, catches him anyway.
It's like the universe saying, you don't get to exit the story through the heroic door. You exit through the messy door.
And if you're his family, that kind of ending does two things. It adds tragedy, which makes the story memorable. And it adds stakes, because now your history isn't just about service and honor. It's also about loss, injustice, and the need to remember.
Which is how these stories get preserved. Not because everyone was calmly documenting facts, but because people cared. They had reasons to repeat it, reasons to insist on their version.
Exactly. And it also explains why the physical anchors, the cathedral, the tomb, the family monuments, matter so much. If your world is full of rumor and rivalry, stone and ritual become a way of saying, no, this is the truth about who we were.
Here lies the man, here lies the claim. Argue with the marble.
And that brings us naturally to the place where memory gets turned into permanence. Llandaff. The monuments, and the way a family can make sure a story doesn't die, even when a person does.
Which is fitting, because medieval fame is basically a negotiation between death and architecture.
If you want to understand how someone like Sir David Mathew stays alive in history, you have to follow the trail to where medieval people stored their legacies. Inside a church, under carved stone, in a place where the living can't avoid walking past the dead.
Medieval memory is aggressively physical, like, you will remember me because you're literally stepping near my name every Sunday.
Exactly. At Llandaff Cathedral, the Mathew family's presence becomes part of the building's story, and that's not an accident. Families with means and influence didn't just want to be buried, they wanted to be seen, linked forever to sacred space, to local identity, to legitimacy.
And they wanted the best seats for eternity. Because hierarchy doesn't stop just because you stopped breathing.
Right, so you get the effigies, the monuments, the visual cues that tell future generations, this person mattered. And when tradition identifies one of those effigies with Sir David, it becomes a kind of amplifier. Even if you never read a line about him, you can stand in that space and feel that he's been placed there to be remembered.
Which is wild, because a cathedral is basically a memory machine that runs on time. It just keeps going. New people come in, old stories stick around, and the building keeps saying, "This mattered. This was important."
And here's the thing. This kind of commemoration doesn't just preserve a life. It also preserves a version of that life. It's not neutral. It's curated. It's a statement of status and identity. The Mathew family is saying, our name belongs in the center of the community's sacred geography.
It's not only pray for my soul, it's acknowledge my role.
Exactly. And that's why the heroic tradition, service to a king, proximity to major events, fits so neatly into the way he's remembered. It's the kind of story that justifies prominence. If you're going to occupy space in a cathedral that everyone respects, you want a narrative that matches.
You don't want your legacy to be local guy who was occasionally difficult. You want loyal knight whose actions touched the crown.
And it's not just about vanity. It's about power continuing after death through descendants. When your family can point to monuments and say, look how long we've been here, it helps them maintain social standing. Memory becomes leverage.
So the tomb isn't only a memorial, it's like a medieval credential, quiet stone and extremely hard to argue with.
Exactly. But there's another complication that sneaks in here, and it's one that makes Sir David Mathew an even better case study. When a family repeats the same names, and when later generations inherit earlier stories, it gets very easy for history to echo.
Ah yes, the classic problem. Too many Davids, not enough clarity.
Exactly. And once that starts happening, once details can slide between people with similar names, the legend becomes even more resilient because it doesn't rely on a single clean biography. It becomes a family narrative, a shared identity, something that can absorb contradictions and still keep its shape.
Which is why the story gets a little detective story-ish. Not because we're trying to strip the legend away, but because the legend itself tells us something about how medieval and early modern people built their past.
Exactly. So here's where the story gets tricky in a way that feels almost inevitable. When you've got a prominent family anchored in the same region for generations, doing the same kinds of public things, marrying into the same circles, and repeating the same first names like it's a sacred duty, you end up with a historical problem. The past starts to rhyme so hard that it blurs.
This is the medieval version of opening a family group chat and realizing half the participants are named David, and 3 of them insist they're David the Elder.
Exactly. And with the Mathews, there are multiple Davids across generations who are wealthy, connected, and involved in local power. That means later storytellers, especially genealogists and family historians, are working with overlapping identities. Similar names, similar roles, similar locations.
And the result is that certain details can drift. Not because someone is malicious, but because memory is lazy, and stories like to land on the most famous name available.
Right? If you've got a heroic tradition attached to Sir David Mathew, it can become a kind of magnet. Bits of biography that belong to one David can get tugged toward the best-known David. Then later writers inherit that blended version and repeat it with confidence.
Confidence is the most renewable resource in historical mistakes.
And it's important to say, this doesn't mean the whole thing collapses. It means we're dealing with layers, contemporary record, later tradition, and family memory. Some parts will be solid, some parts will be polished. Some parts will be the kind of thing that started as a reasonable claim and slowly turned into a perfect story.
Because perfect stories are addictive. He did a brave thing becomes he did the bravest possible thing, and then eventually it becomes he did it while being 7 feet tall, and also everyone clapped.
Exactly. And those echoes are part of why Sir David Mathew is such a fascinating episode subject. He isn't just a person we're learning about. He's a lesson in how history is remembered and used. When later generations cite him, they're not only talking about the 15th century, they're also talking about what they want their family and their region to be associated with: loyalty, honor, proximity to kings, and rightful status.
And that desire can reshape the story without anyone even noticing. It's like the narrative is doing what narratives do, smoothing the rough edges so it fits in your hand.
Exactly. Which means when we look at the big claims, battlefield heroism, prestigious office, dramatic death, we can treat them less like a checklist and more like a portrait. The portrait tells us what mattered, what was remembered, and what was worth repeating.
And that's the key point. Even if you argue over the details, the fact that these are the details people kept alive tells you what kind of man they believed Sir David to be, or what kind of man they needed him to be.
Right. And that brings us to the payoff. Why any of this matters beyond the Mathew family, beyond one cathedral, beyond one set of stories, because Sir David Mathew is basically a doorway into a bigger truth about the period.
Which is that history isn't just made in crowns and parliaments. It's made in local offices, in regional networks, and in the way families turn participation into identity.
Exactly. And once you see that, Sir David stops being a footnote and becomes a lens, one that shows how the Wars of the Roses weren't just England's civil war, but a conflict that pulled in border regions and local elites and left behind a trail of memory that still shapes how communities tell their past.
And honestly, it also shows you how a person can be both real and legendary at the same time, without that being a contradiction. Medieval life is messy. Medieval memory is messier.
And in the end, that mess is what makes the story feel alive. Which brings us to our final stretch. What we can take away from Sir David Mathew as a character, as a symbol, and as a reminder that history is as much about what people carry forward as it is about what happened.
So let's bring it home.
So when you pull back from the family echoes, the battlefield legend, the local danger, and the cathedral stone that tries to freeze it all in place, you end up with something bigger than one man. Sir David Mathew matters because he sits right where medieval history actually happens, between the grand claims of kings and the everyday machinery of power that makes those claims real.
He's the connective tissue guy. Not the crown, not the throne, but the person close enough to the center that his choices and his loyalties have consequences. He's the type of figure who proves that national history isn't just written in palaces. It's written in border regions, in relationships, in who can mobilize people, who can enforce decisions, and who can survive the fallout.
And he's also a reminder that in the 15th century, legitimacy isn't a warm, abstract idea. It's a practical thing. It's who gets recognized, who gets rewarded, who gets remembered. The tradition that ties him to Edward IV, especially at a moment like Towton, captures exactly what the era valued: visible loyalty, courage under pressure, and service that can be translated into status.
Which is why the story sticks, even if you don't treat every detail like a sworn affidavit. Because the shape of it makes sense. A man rises through local influence, ends up pulled into national crisis, does something that people remember as decisive, and comes home with a brighter reputation than the neighborhood can comfortably handle.
And that homecoming part is the human punch, because it's so easy to imagine the emotional whiplash. One day you're surviving the chaos of civil war, the next you're back in a world where everyone knows your family name and everyone has an opinion about what you deserve.
Medieval fame is a candle you carry through a windstorm. It lights your way, but it also tells everyone where you are.
Exactly. And then the ending, whatever the precise details were, fits the world he lived in. A time where a person could navigate national catastrophe and still be vulnerable to local violence, because the state doesn't have the kind of monopoly on force we assume today. Feuds, rivalries, public disorder, those aren't side plots. They're part of the system.
And after that, what survives isn't just the body, it's the story. It's what descendants repeat, what communities whisper, what stone and tradition keep alive, even when paper records are thin. That's why you can stand in a place like Llandaff and feel the past acting like it never really left.
Which is the final takeaway for me. Sir David Mathew is a case study in how a life becomes a legacy. Not because history is always clear, but because people are stubborn about meaning. They preserve what helps them explain who they are, where they came from, and why their name belongs in the room.
And it's also why this episode is evergreen. Not just because 15th century border politics never go out of style, although, weirdly, they kind of don't, but because the mechanism is timeless. People still build identity around stories of loyalty, service, sacrifice, and proximity to big events. We still argue about the details. We still care about the symbols.
And we still love a character who feels like he's standing in two worlds at once: Wales and England, local and national, record and legend. Sir David Mathew is that hinge point, the kind of person history depends on and then conveniently forgets, unless someone keeps the memory lit.
Which is why we're here, to keep it lit, but also to poke it a little and see what it's made of.
That's it for today's episode of the History AI Podcast. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe and leave a 5-star review. We mean it. 5 stars helps the podcast grow, it helps new listeners find us, and it lets us keep making these dives into the stories that don't always get center stage.
Also, share the show with a friend. Send it to the medieval history person in your life, or the person who loves Civil War chaos, or the one friend who definitely owns a cloak.
And if you've got a topic you want us to cover, reach out on social media. We love listener suggestions, and we're always building the list.
Don't forget the new merchandise. Link in the show notes. Dress like you're about to administer a cathedral estate and then accidentally become a legend.
Special thanks to all of you for listening, especially everyone who rates, reviews, subscribes, and shares. That support is what keeps this show growing, and a 5-star review really does make a difference.
Until next time,
I'm Chuck.
and I'm Marco. Bye, everyone.
Born in a borderland of whispers and stone, where Welsh hills watch English thrones. A boy learned early how power moves, not by the sword, but by who you choose. Courts were crowded, crowns were thin, loyalties bent like bows in the wind. And he stepped quiet through candlelight halls, learning when to stand, learning when to fall. Names were traded like silver and wine, every promise came with a line. But some men rise without a sound, leaving footprints no one found. Raise the banner of the falcon high, not every battle is fought eye to eye. While kings chase glory and blood-soaked fame, some men went playing a longer game. In the shadow of crowns, in the turning of fate, he held the door while history waited. Not carved in gold, not sung by flame, but the realm still stood when the morning came. He watched the kingdom tear at its seams, red roses blooming in fevered dreams. Brothers turned on brothers for acclaim, same blood, different name. While steel rang loud on muddy ground, he kept the king while the world burned down. A steady hand in a shaking age, ink and seals instead of rain. Every letter, every vow held the crown together somehow. When the throne was just a fragile chair, balanced on a careful prayer. Raise the banner of the falcon high, not every battle is fought eye to eye. While nights rode out chasing songs and scars, he mapped the future behind closed doors. In the quiet rooms where decisions stay, he chose survival over glory's blaze. Not carved in gold, not sung by flame, but the realm still stood when the morning came. History loves the clash of steel, the shout, the charge, the final kneel. But it forgets the ones who stood between the crown and chaos unseen. When dynasties cracked and banners fell, someone had to know the kingdom well, to keep a crown from tipping down, to keep a country from tearing itself out. No songs were written the night he died, no bells rang out across the sky, but the road still ran, the law still breathed, because someone stayed when others left. So raise the banner of the falcon high, for the watchers who never passed by, for the men who knew when not to fight, who kept the torch through endless nights. In the margins where the real work stays, the footnotes, history barely saves. Not carved in gold, not crowned by flame, but everything changed because he remained. Crowns may fall and roses fade, but the quiet choices still get made. And somewhere between the throne and the land, a steady man still takes his stand.